So again, the recording has started. Welcome to the third lecture of the course Business Technology and Innovation. Today we'll be talking about diffusion of innovation. But before we start, some practicalities. So you could sign up for a group until today. I noticed that there are a couple of groups not consisting of 4 or 5 people. So the business proposal assignment is really doable with 4 out of 5 people. But I did notice there are 2 or 3 groups here. So there are 3 groups of 3 or 2 or 3 people, and I still think that it is doable with 3 people. But if you're in a group with 2 or 3 people and you want to redistribute yourself in another group, please email me and contact me to see if we can reshuffle the groups so that everyone is in a group with 4 or 5 people. If you're in a group with 3, let me know and see what we can do. I have no guarantee that that I can, add someone else to the group, but let's see if we can do something about that. See, do we have any other practicalities for today? I don't think so. No, nothing. So having said that, welcome to the lecture. Today we're going to talking about diffusion of innovation. So last week we talked about, okay, what is an innovation? What is the innovation process in an organization? What kind of information typologies do you have? And then I said, so when you look at innovation, you have the innovation itself, but you also have the diffusion of the innovation. So once you created an innovation, you want to bring it to market and earn money. More about that in the next lecture. And then, if all goes well, the innovation kind of diffusions throughout the population. Well, the population may not be everyone, but the population is all those who are interested potentially in your innovation. And today we're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about, okay, what actually happens when innovations enter the market, and how do they diffuse throughout the market. We're going to do that by talking about 3 main theories on diffusion of innovation, of which 2 are actually scientific theories, and the third one originated from practice, but has actually become more or less a scientific theory. SCurve's Rochester's diffusion of innovation model, I think the most well-known, non-cited theory of innovation, and Gartner's hype cycle, which Gartner is a consultancy company. They created the hype cycle, which is also a model of innovation. So let's start with SCurve's. This is an SCurve. This tells you the relationship between the amount of effort you have to put in an innovation and the performance of the innovation. You can imagine when a company starts innovating, so think of a really new type of technology, think of an electric car, for example, that in the beginning is really hard to profit from your innovation. So because you have to spend a lot of money in research and development, and in marketing, etc., before the innovation actually takes off. So it takes quite a lot of effort at first, and you actually see no or little improvements in performance. I'll explain more about performance in a moment, but bear with me. When an innovation kind of takes off and enters the market for a larger group of people, you can imagine that the innovation grows and grows and grows, and it becomes easier to make money. So to produce the innovation, to market the innovation, and more people adopt it. So the performance of the innovation increases. Well, finally, if you reach the end of a technology cycle, it becomes harder and harder again to improve the innovation, because the innovation has kind of matured, and it becomes more and more difficult to actually profit and to improve the innovation, and you have to pump more and more and more money into it in order to get fairly little in return. So think of where we are now with, with televisions, for example. Of course, companies still profit from the sale of televisions, but the technology is really kind of mature yet, or still. So you have to pump a huge amount of money for relatively little advantage over previous televisions. So we have OLED instead of LED screens, for example. But they require a lot of innovation for not a completely new technology, and not a great incentive for people to buy a new television. So that's kind of an S-curve. So once if an innovation is beginning phase, leads to relatively little performance. Once an innovation takes off, you can earn a lot of money with it. And once an innovation is really ripe, then it becomes increasingly difficult to enter the market and try to profit from it. And that's what an S-curve basically explains. So what is performance? Well, performance basically means improvements in company. No, it's not really true. Well, performance can mean a lot of things. So in the theory of S-curves, the word performance is deliberately vague. So sometimes performance means performance of the organization. So to what extent can an organization profit from the innovation? But sometimes performance also means improvements in the technology itself. Effort can also mean a lot of things. Can mean the time you have to spend in order to keep innovating, keep making the product better. But it can also mean like the real work and the amount of man hours, the amount of R&Ds you have to put in the innovation. So, well, I think you see this, for example, with, so let's give another example. For example, the oil industry. When people started pumping up oil, it was relatively easy to pump up oil, but there was not that much that people could do with oil, so it was not really profitable. Then it really took off, and it's extremely profitable. But now, if a company wants to pump up more oil, it becomes increasingly difficult. So, companies like Shell have to spend billions and billions and billions of euros in developing new technologies to pump up less accessible oil, fracking, for example. So we're now kind of at the limit of the technology curve for oil, and it may be time for a new S-curve for another technology to gather energy from, wind, solar, etc. So what you see in an S-curve, and if you compare the oil industry to, iPhones, for example, you see that with the iPhone, we're now, I think, about, well, with smartphones in particular, we are kind of here, I think. So we have fairly limited performance improvements over each new version of the iPhone. Apple can spend like $1 billion in a new camera, but it's only a new camera. So maybe we enter a new curve with a completely new type of phone, for example. So again, an S-curve. So with a new technology or any innovation is really slow at first. It requires testing. There are a lot of errors in technology and design that you have to find out, etc. And then once a technology really takes off, you can make rapid improvements in the technology that makes it better and better and better and cheaper to produce. But once the technology has settled in, it becomes more and more and more difficult to improve upon the innovation. So things like effort and time, so how long it takes to innovate, how much money it takes to innovate, is often on the x-axis. And I usually call it effort instead of time, because, well, time may obscure effort increase. So let me explain that a bit further. I'm not sure if you are aware of Moore's law, but it's often used in computer science. And it kind of explains how the improvement of computer chips, and more said that the performance of computer chips would like double every 2 years, and it doubled every 18, but it was later corrected to doubling every 18 months. And you have a lot of different types of curves, but so for example, they say, well, the speed and power of a computer doubles every 2 years. So in 4 years from now, it's 4 times. In 6 years, it's 8 times as powerful as 8 years before, etc. And that's kind of Moore's law, but originally it was a bit more technical, and Moore said, well, it's the number of transistors, so the number of unique computer of the smallest component that a computer consists of is a transistor, and a computer chip consists of billions of those transistors. And Moore said, well, the amount of these transistors that you can fit on a square inch of a computer chip is kind of a good indicator for a computer's performance. And he said that doubles every 2 years. So it started out with that on a computer chip of an inch by an inch, like 2.5 by 2.5 centimeters, you could fit 1,000 transistors, which are really old-fashioned. And nowadays, well, this is from 2018 or so, we can fit like 50 billion, or not really true, 30 billion or so so 30 billion of those transistors on a 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch computer chip. Which is really a great achievement. You know, they measure in nanometers. So from a computer hardware perspective, this is really great. Even if you do not really understand the hardware components, this is really a great achievement that we can do this. So more about this, by the way, how a computer works and how what a transistor actually is. We talk about in the additional lecture accompanying lecture 8, in which we talk about computer hardware and software. But for here, it is important that this is kind of an S-curve. It doesn't look like an S-curve because this is a logarithmic scale, but it is kind of an S-curve. So you see that in the beginning, it was really, really hard to cram more transistors on a computer chip, but then they kept innovating and coming up with new ways of even cramming more resistors on a computer chip. And let me go back to the previous slide. It looks like this is kind of a linear function, but if you look at how much effort it takes in order to cram more and more and more transistors on a computer chip, it's actually this function, because it is so much more expensive than before now to improve upon how you build computer chips. So computer chips have also already reached a kind of a limit of technology, and we are waiting for like a revolution in computer chip technology, like quantum chips or so, in order to start off a new S-curve. So that was a lot of explanation by for the simple statement that time is not the same as effort. So it looks like computer chips double in capacity every 2 years, but the amount of effort they need to put into it is ever increasing, and it becomes more and more difficult. So what's the important takeaway of this? The important takeaway is that I'm going to switch slides now again. So the important takeaway of this is that an S-curve kind of tells something about the current state of technology in a certain field. So I'm going back to the previous slides in a moment. So it helps organizations decide when it's best to enter a market or to start or stop investing in a certain innovation or technology. So you can imagine when that So you have certain organizations who really are R&D organizations, and they are kind of here. But if you want to enter the market, this would be a great time to enter the market, because this is the time of the largest productivity increases and performance increases in technology. And once the technology is really kind of done, it becomes, well, you have to have a very good incentive to enter the market. So if the technology is here, yeah, why would you try something similar? Because it becomes much more difficult to innovate. You need to have a really good idea or really an alternative to the innovation in order to enter the same market. And that is because this happens with innovation, with technological innovations. So a new innovation may start a new S-curve, which makes the previous innovation obsolete. Obsolete means that we don't need the previous innovation anymore. So for example, well, you have different types of S-curves. So you can have a new innovation once the previous technology really has matured a lot, but you can also have a rather quick innovation. So for example, this right slide is an example of vinyl records versus compact discs. So vinyl records already existed for 40 years or so, I think, before the compact disc entered the market. And the vinyl records were already in their maturity phase. There was little innovation that you could do with vinyl records. And then they introduced compact disc players, and that created what is called discontinuity, and created a whole new S-curve and a whole new innovation cycle. And then compact disc was taken over by MP3 and digital music. So this is called the fermentation stage, where a new innovation needs to ferment, so it needs to come to fruition in order to for organizations to benefit. Then this increasing curve here is takeoff dominant design, in which the innovation actually takes on a life on its own in order to determine what the end state will look like. And the maturity is once the innovation really has diffused and everyone has the innovation and there's little improvement. Think mobile phones now. And then discontinuity means if you have a new S-curve, a new innovation starting. So for example, this is what happens with vinyl records versus compact discs. So organizations could really benefit from vinyl records a long time before the compact disc was introduced. But when you compare MP3 players versus digital music, for example, it was really an S-curve like this. So you had MP3 players, but quite soon afterwards, actually complete digital music and Spotify was introduced. So they got discontinued quite quickly. And there are even other examples. So I used to own a Sony mini disc player. It was kind of in between the MP3 players and the compact discs, and it was a pretty good way of listening and recording music. But it only was popular for like 2-3 years or so before MP3 players were introduced. So the mini disc by Sony never ever left this stage. Because a new technology took off, MP3 players, that completely took over the market. So these are called discontinuous S-curves. So when you think about technology and technological innovation, this is what usually happens. So the technology matures and is taken over by a new technology, etc. But it can happen at different rates. So for example, for a mobile phone, it has reached maturity, but I think it will be a while before we have the next real innovation in mobile phone technology that starts a completely new curve. Although I think I have said this last week, if I'm not sure, of course, if I would be completely sure, I would be very, very rich if I could predict that. So for organizations and for thinking about the role of technology and the role of innovation in organizations, this is really important because it forces you to think, okay, when should I as an organization invest in an innovation? So where in the curve are we? So are we kind of in a maturity stage? Is it then it may not be useful because it's kind of already developed and maybe difficult to enter. But maybe we see a new technology around the corner and we can invest in that. But of course, it's hard for organizations to do. You know, think of Apple with their mobile phones. They have a certain experience with doing it. You know, they have routines, production, equipment, structures, the strategy. It's all focused on their current technology. So it's pretty hard to switch to something completely new. So often as organizations, it's difficult to decide, okay, when should we stop investing and when should we switch to something new? Because it's not simply a matter of, oh, we used to do this, now let's go do something else. It's a complete overhaul of your organization. And finally, this is also relevant for technology in organizations. So think of the moment when you have to switch to a new or a rather new version of your IT software or IT systems in your organization. So even if we take a relatively simple example, so our department has recently switched from, you know, our old-fashioned regular Office, Microsoft Office, in which we, you know, had a network drive or a place on our own hard drives in which we store documents. We have switched to Office 365. So everything we do now is in the cloud. So we use Office web-based, but still also installed on our computers. But we use OneDrive to store all of our data. At least that's what you're supposed to do. It was about time that we did that. Because it was pretty unsafe that everyone stored like their data everywhere. You know, people used OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, and a lot of other different types of storage. So it was about time that we did that. But of course, for the universities, it was very hard to switch to the new version, even if this is not a completely different innovation, because people were used to working with their old-fashioned Office. They were used to using Dropbox instead of OneDrive. Our IT department was completely focused on, you know, on supporting the way we worked. So it's pretty difficult to switch to a new innovation. So even if you were like kind of here, okay, Office, okay, we know that we need a way to store data. So we need some kind of innovation. It was still very hard. So even if we realized this, it was even very hard to switch because of all the structural aspects that the university had to take into account. And we talk more about that when we talk about people and structure of an organization. So we talk more about how you can convince and communicate in order to convince people to, to convince people to use innovation. These two sets of lines, didn't I just do this with vinyl records versus compact discs and MP3 players? So see if I can find another example of a technology that was made fairly quickly redundant. Yeah, for this discontinuity, there is for the right one, I think an example of the previous generation of mobile phones, so not the smartphones, with smartphones. So I think there the lines were there. The line. So okay, so before you had an iPhone and a smartphone with a touchscreen, we used to have a Nokia or a Motorola with a flip screen and with keys. I don't know if you remember that. And then there was kind of a discontinuity, and there was a new technology curve in which smartphones were introduced, which kicked off an all new technology curve. And with regular smartphones, we are kind of about, well, not yet reached the maturity stage, but we're kind of about here or so. So there were still improvements to be made, but the smartphone was so different from the previous technologies that we kind of started anew with a mobile phone. So that is an example of smartphones having existed like 15 years or so before the mobile phones having existed like 15 years or so before the introduction of the smartphone. And then there was kind of a discontinuity where the smartphone took over when the original mobile phone was kind of here in the innovation curve. Car keys without electronics, a good example. Car keys without electronics. I have a very old-fashioned car. So you mean that you're going to click your key and the door, or that you just walk to your car and the door opens automatically? Something
yes,
like that?
That's what I mean.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think maybe I'm not really an expert in, I don't really know that much about cars. And maybe car keys would be a bit. Let me think about that for a moment before I say something stupid. Before I say something even more stupid. I think it may be that car keys itself are maybe a too small innovation to give them their own technology curve. So maybe they have to be integrated with the innovation in cars in general. But if we use that example, then indeed you could say that there was much more to innovate with a car key, and that suddenly one company said, well, we can build in electronics in our car key so that the door opens automatically, or you can click the car key so that it closes automatically. And then we kind of started indeed a new technology curve, which also started, I think, about here. But it may be, and now of course we have car keys which you don't even need. It's not a old-fashioned key, so you don't plug it into anything anymore, and that may be a new technology curve. Yeah. If an industry witnessed a new SCurve, which is the best decision an organization would make, change or sell their business. Yeah, it depends on the organization, because it's it kind of depends on your ability to innovate as an organization. So if you look at Apple, they don't only make an iPhone, then they know there will be new innovations. So they also invest in a lot of other products, Apple Watches and probably hundreds of different products we haven't even heard of because it's still in the innovation stage. So of course they have the capacity to change their business. For other organizations, it may be more difficult. There are a lot of examples of organizations who went bankrupt because they could not switch. Think of Kodak or other organizations that used to produce cameras, old-fashioned cameras before we started to have digital cameras and smartphones. That they were not able to, for them, this was such a discontinuity that they went bankrupt or had to sell. So it depends on the organization. But in general, it is wise as an organization to invest part of your profits in research and development so that you can keep an eye on innovation. So that's why it's important to keep track of technological innovation. Let's see, what did I miss? There is it, analog versus digital cameras. Yes, exactly. So that's a very good example of also of a curve like this. So there was I think there was not that much to improve in analog cameras, and then we had a complete technology switch to digital cameras. Isn't this example with the mobile phone a kind of product innovation as well? Yeah, so I realized that when I when I said it, is that it's not always easy to define when you have a discontinuity or where it's just a continuation and an improvement. So in reality, I think that you can also have curves which go like this, which would be, you know, you could say, okay, well, here we have the introduction of a new technology or the continuation or a kind of a re-improvement of an existing technology. But for all intents and purposes for organizational consequences, it doesn't really matter. So if you go like this and you say it's basically the same technology, it still requires you to think about, okay, what is happening here? There is some kind of discontinuity. There is some kind of a new spur in innovation. So if you draw it like this, or like, sorry, if you draw it like this or like this, that doesn't really matter in the end. So, and sometimes it's like clearly this. So analog versus digital cameras was an entirely new type of product, you know, with entirely new technology. But from a regular mobile phone to a smartphone, maybe less clear cut, although it also are different technology. So the left set of lines would be a rapid turning in the, like I said, so the MP3 player is one, the fax machine is something else. So the fax machine became popular in the 80s, 90s, was relatively soon taken over again by email. So the fax machine only enjoyed a relatively short period of popularity before it was taken over by online communication entirely. So for the fax machine, so you have fax, and then they introduced online communication, and then it was pretty soon over with the fax. I'm not even sure if you remember what a fax machine is. Yeah, it is different for each product, how long a curve normally takes, and it goes quicker and quicker with the introduction of newer technology. So, for example, if you look at how long it took for the phone, you know, the old-fashioned landline phone, to diffuse through society, it took like 60 years or so. And then if you look at how long it took for the mobile phones, it was for smartphones, it was 5 years, maybe even less. So it depends on the type of product, and it depends on, you know, where we are in general with technological innovation. And I think I have an example on the slide when we talk about diffusion of innovation. Okay, let's clear this. Clear our drawings. Okay. Yeah, so that's the first one. The left is slow and right is fast. Well, no, not left is slow. Left is an innovation that is taken over quickly by a new innovation. So the fax machine only existed for a couple of years before it was taken over by online communication. So if you as an organization think, oh, well, the fax machine is really taking off and is really getting popular, but if you then fail to realize or fail to see that the internet is just around the corner, you would be investing heavily in fax machines here, because you think fax machines, they're really taking off. But if you forget or if you miss online communication, then you would invest heavily in fax machines. And then like 2 years later, you would find out, oh, people are now using email. So left means that the product is that you quite quickly after the introduction of one innovation have a new innovation which makes the other innovation obsolete. Product innovation is improvement product features, or SCurve innovation should change because of interaction. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So an SCurve really is about the introduction of a completely new technology that allow you to, that force you to rethink what you're currently doing. So like slower innovations, new versions of televisions, of phones, of computer systems, etc., is relatively easy. But if you suddenly see, well, we are kind of reaching a stage in which a new technology could be introduced, it forces you to rethink your entire business. Yes, and sometimes it takes a long time before a new technology takes off, which is an example of the right curve. So vinyl records were really in a maturity stage before we introduced the compact disc, and sometimes it goes really quickly. So we just got used to fax machines before we got email in organizations. But I think this happens more often than this. I cannot think of a lot of examples in which a new technology was almost immediately taken over by another technology. But there probably are some. Maybe DVDs as well. So I think, to give a final example, when you think of DVDs, they were really taking off. So we all bought Blu-ray players and invested in physical DVDs. But actually, quite quickly, the technology was taken over by, online video on demand. So DVDs were very short-lived before a new technology was introduced, which really took over. I think that if you need more explanation, let me know. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue with diffusion of innovation. Well, Rogers died a couple of years ago, and he was like the major innovation researcher. I think if you are, especially if you're a pre-master student, you may or probably have encountered the diffusion of innovation curve already, which explains how an innovation diffusion through society, which basically says, well, if you have a new innovation, so then you start out with people who really want the innovation. They've got the innovators, then you have the early adopters who adopt the innovation later on, then you have the early and late majority, and then finally you have the laggards, the people who resist taking up an innovation until the very last. Think of a mobile phone. It started out with people who are really into tech. Let's do smartphones. So smartphones started out with people who were really in tech, into the technology. They were the innovators, and then suddenly you had people who were quite early with adapting a smartphone, because they were really popular and they wanted to have a smartphone. Then came the early and later majority, who were a bit more hesitant of adapting a smartphone, and finally, it's your grandparents who adopted the smartphone at the very last. So they were the laggards. And this kind of explains, it's a normal curve, which you learn from statistics, which explains the adoption of the innovation. But Rogers, if you read Rogers' book, and it's in literature, chapter 1 for today, you will realize that his book is not only about this diffusion curve, it's about much more. He explains the whole innovation and diffusion process, and explain how people personally adopt an innovation, how an innovation is adopted through a certain social system. He explains what technology is. So he explains much more than only this curve. So first of all, let's start with how he defines diffusion of innovation. So he defines diffusion by saying that innovation is communicated throughout a certain social system over time through certain channels. So he specifically always talks about that an innovation is communicated. So of course you adopt an innovation. So if you think of a smartphone, you not immediately think about communicating. So you buy a smartphone, but he calls it how an innovation is communicated, because the way and the reason we adopt a smartphone is because we hear and we learn about smartphones, and we hear from others that they exist and what they can do. So he says all innovation is a product of communication about that innovation that leads to adoption, and without communication there could be no adoption of innovations. Moreover, not all innovations are, of course, technological innovations that are physical products. You also have innovation in processes. So you can also see like the adoption of vaccinations is also a kind of an innovation process. Of course, not everyone could be vaccinated at the same time, but if they could have, you would have people who have taken the vaccination first, and then they would say, oh, well, I didn't really get sick from COVID, and then they would convince other people, and then finally, when people see from, well, oh, you do not drop dead after a year, you get the late majority and the laggards who then finally adopt the innovation and get themselves vaccinated, hopefully. So you can also think of a vaccination as a kind of an innovation diffuses through society. So it's not always a physical innovation, not always a smartphone or something like that. It can also be a process innovation of service. So if you look at this definition, you see that there are kind of 4 aspects to it. So he says, innovation is about, diffusion of innovation is about adoption of the innovation. In order to do so, you have to communicate the innovation. That takes time, and an innovation is diffused through a social system. So let's discuss each of these 4 components of diffusion of innovation. Starting with the adoption of the innovation. So the adoption of the innovation is basically 2 different aspects. So diffusion is, of course, an aggregated process where every individual for themselves decides to adopt the innovation. And then together, that means that the innovation will adopt and diffuse through a social system. So which means that ultimately, if you look at diffusion of the innovation, it consists of a lot of individual decisions to adopt the innovation. So the adoption of an innovation is ultimately an individual purchase or an individual adoption decision. And take into account that individual here means the ones who will adopt your innovation. So if you are a business-to-business organization and you cater only to other companies, then the individual in this instance is other organizations. And the innovation process, therefore, kind of the individual adoption of an innovation is basically an information seeking and information processing activity in which you, as an individual, try to find out information about the innovation, and based on whether you like the innovation or not, decide to adopt the innovation. And yeah, that's a bit much. So I suggest we have a short break. So there are a lot of theories about the adoption of the innovation, and there are a lot of theories that describe how individuals will adopt an innovation over time, and what factors influence that decision to adopt an innovation or technology. Rogers himself has distinguished 5 characteristics, but there are other theories as well. But we discuss that after the break. So let's have a break and let's start again in 10 bit over 10 minutes, so 5:45-ish. Okay. So I suggest we continue with diffusion of innovation. So welcome back. Before the break, I told that innovation is diffusion of innovation. It's a process whereby innovation diffuses through the whole population, but ultimately it's like an individual decision, and an individual basis decision to adopt an innovation based on what he or she sees in her surroundings, and therefore decides to adopt an innovation. So you learn from an innovation, and you try to find out, is this useful for me? Can I use this? Will I use this, etc.? And then you decide. Well, Rogers himself has devised like 5 different product characteristics that define. I'm sorry, wrong slide here. There we are. Rogers himself has sorry, yeah, we're getting there. I wanted to check if something was still in the presentation, but it was. So Rogers himself has come up with 5 different product characteristics that together determine whether or not you will adopt an innovation. So he distinguishes relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, triability, and observability. In which relative advantage is that you think the innovation is useful on top of other innovations. So, okay, the example I just gave in our organization, that we switched from regular Office to Office 365 combined with OneDrive. Many people in our organization did not see and still not see the advantage of the new innovation over the other innovation. So what's the relative advantage that helps determine decide if it's useful? Compatibility means that an innovation fits another innovation. So for example, the reason that a smartphone was such a change in innovation was that it was also difficult to use. It was different to use compared to a regular old-fashioned phone because it didn't really fit the previous technologies. And in this case, it was a very important innovation that was readily adopted. But you generally see that if an innovation is compatible, provides kind of the same interface, looks and feels similar as previous technologies, then it's then easier to adopt the innovation, simply because you're kind of already used to it. So compatibility with other innovations. So that's, for example, the reason why a watch, a smartwatch, as you see here, still looks like a watch. That's at least one of the reasons. Complexity, of course, is relatively simple. It is the product complex or easy to use. Trialability is can I try the innovation before I adopt it? And you see that in many marketing campaigns and for many innovations, they have like a 30-day money-back guarantee, those kind of things. That is to stimulate triability of the innovation. And finally, there's observability, which means can you observe others using the innovation? Because if you do, and if you see that other people have adopted it and are able to work with it, then it becomes easier for you to adopt the innovation yourself. And these are kind of obvious characteristics to that lead to ultimate acceptance of the innovation. But this is not the only model. And I think most important to remember is the model we will discuss in the lecture on IT and individuals in organizations, because there we will explain a model of technology adoption, which I think kind of takes into account the most important characteristics, which is this model here, and that we'll be discussing in lecture 7, I think, 8, no, 7, no, 8, 9, well, in one of the upcoming lectures. But to introduce you through the theory, that general theory that explains how people adopt technology and how they adopt innovation in general is based on 2 main factors. So people form an impression of the usefulness of an innovation or a technology in general, and of the perceived ease of use of an innovation. That together determines attitude toward the innovation. Do you like the attitude or not? And that finally determines adoption of the intention and adoption of the innovation. Which technology cycle? Anderson and Tush. If I don't remember the name, probably not. But let me check. I'll check after the lecture, okay? Because I don't remember by heart which model it is. There are a couple of models in the literature for today, also about types of innovation that we did not discuss and will not discuss during the lecture. So those you don't have to remember for the exam. So basically, if I don't discuss the model or theory in the lectures, it's not exam. I will not ask about them in the exam. Or if you have some time left at the end of the lecture, let me check the exact model. So SCurves are important for as a technology cycle. The Rogers is important, but not all. So this technology acceptance model, we'll discuss this more in lecture 8, 9, whatever. But for now, important to remember is that basically in order to adopt something, you have to find it useful and you have to find it easy to use. And if you map those aspects by Rogers onto perceived usefulness, it makes kind of sense. So the relative advantage and compatibility kind of relates to, okay, if it's useful before, it must be useful now. Relative advantage is some kind of usefulness. Observability, seeing other people used as well. And maybe things like complexity and triability convince you more of the perceived ease of use. Although it's not, you know, it can be a bit differently depending on the technology. So these factors map quite nicely on the 2 main dimensions of what convinces people to adopt an innovation. But there are much more. So you have specific aspects of perceived use, which are mentioned here. You have normative influences of people you know who use the innovation, result demonstrability, which is too difficult to explain now, but we'll get there in the other lecture. So these factors that Roger mentions here are just examples of different factors that can affect adoption of an innovation. And we'll discuss more about this in a later lecture. But remember for now that usefulness and ease of use is ultimately what determines if people decide to adopt an innovation. So that's the diffusion process by an individual. So the second aspect, so remember, we had a lot of models, but remember that the definition of diffusion of innovation is by which an innovation is communicated through time through a social system. So we just had diffusion, so the diffusion process, and we now talk about clickety-click communication. We have many courses in our study program which deal with exactly this. because we are in the Communication and Information Science department. So we have many topics like communications theory and also many marketing related topics in which we discuss the different ways that you can communicate about innovation. So it's basically convincing people, taking away resistance for adopting a technology. So how an innovation is communicated throughout a social system in general is via mass media channels. So at the beginning, at the main stage of the adoption curve, you see that it's usually mass media campaigns that convince people of buying something. And you see that in the earlier and later stages of the adoption, the innovation diffuses more via interpersonal channels. So you can imagine that if an innovation is new, it's mostly diffused through interpersonal communication, people who are the innovators who adopt it and show it to their friends who then adopt it. But you can imagine that when an innovation really takes off, you get marketing campaigns for, adopt this innovation. And then later on, when your grandma has to adopt the innovation, it's again an interpersonal process, and you explain to your grandma, well, grandma, everyone has a mobile phone. You can also see my pictures on Instagram. So then it becomes an interpersonal process again. So in general, there are two ways and a hybrid way of communicating innovation through a social system, via mass media, via interpersonal channels, and somewhere in between via opinion leaders and influencers, as we call them nowadays. So interpersonal channels is your social network, so your strong and your weak ties. So strong ties are your close friends, weak ties is your more extended network. You recommend things to friends, you have opinion leaders, people in your network you find very important. And those are the people who convince you of adopting something new. So this is pretty close to what we've learned in communication theory last year for those bachelor students out there. And for pre-master students who take this course, this is what you learn in other courses as well. So we continue with this one in social media marketing and resistance and persuasion as master courses in marketing, communication, and new media, which is also offered as a bachelor course now. You learn much more about the communication process. So for us, for this course, this is not that important. So let's continue. Just remember that you have to communicate and convince people to adopt an innovation. So it takes time to adopt an innovation. It takes individual time to convince people to adopt an innovation. So because people have to learn that it exists, they have to be persuaded by the thing you saw on the previous slide. They have to find it useful and easy to use. Then they have to decide it, and then they have to implement the innovation, and then they need to have confirmation, like experience, and in order to continue use. So innovation takes time because it's an individual process, from finding out about the innovation to finally implementing the innovation. Let's explain that first. Our opinion leaders different from influencers? Well, they're not. There are different types of influencers. So the term influencers here mostly relates to those social media influencers with a huge following, who are kind of in between celebrities and friends. But of course, you have opinion leaders on different levels. So, for example, if you always listen to a friend of yours who recommends you to adopt a new phone or another technology, then he or she is an influencer, is an opinion leader in your own network. So an opinion leader can be an influencer, but not every influencer is an opinion leader in your network. So basically, an opinion leader is someone with connections who you personally look up to in order for the adoption process. And an influencer basically provides the same function, the same functionality, but an influencer usually is kind of more is not in your own personal network. Although you We do a lot of research about the effects of influencers, and usually you think that an influencer is in your network. That's why they are so powerful as brand endorsers. But more about that when you enter the master and you take the course Social Media Marketing and other courses related to online marketing. Okay, fine. It may be interesting to, and then I quit the whole side stories. A colleague of mine, Loes Janssen, which you may have had with Communication and the Influencing, we wrote a paper about influencer endorsements. So, you know, social media influencers and if they are effective in endorsing products. And well, indeed they are, and they are exactly popular because we see them as opinion leaders. So we see them as both friends and we see them as someone who we look up to. And those two processes together, so we see them as both friends and as people we look up to, so as kind of celebrities, that is what makes those influencers especially effective in product endorsement. So that's a paper we wrote in the Journal of Advertising, International Journal of Advertising. If you want to know more about that, feel free to contact me. But less relevant for this course. So getting back to innovation, so the diffusion of innovation process over time is an individual process from knowledge to final confirmation that you actually like the innovation. And confirmation is especially here because often there is a drop in enjoyment after first use. You know, a new innovation, I have a new phone, and then you start using the phone and then suddenly you realize, oh yeah, is that it? And then after a while you come to get used to it and you cannot live without. But usually there's a kind of a drop in enjoyment, which leads you to kind of readjust to the innovation, and you need to confirm that you actually like the innovation or not. And you can also drop the innovation as well. So it's an individual process, but the diffusion of innovation is also a diffusion through the social system. So it also takes time for an innovation to adopt through the whole social system that you want to adopt the innovation. And again, the social system we are talking about is not every individual in society. So it depends on who you think the population is. So if you make a very specialized product in which only 100 people in the world are interested, then that is your population. And then your whole social system, those 100 people. But then within those 100 people, you still have the early adopters and the laggards, etc. So a social system does not necessarily mean society as a whole. It depends on your target group. So this is basically the whole idea. So innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards, and you kind of see, yes, you only look at the relevant population for a specific technology. So, for example, an enterprise resource planning system in an organization is a huge IT system which connects many other information systems in your organization. So such a technology is only relevant for medium to large size organizations. So you don't want your grandma to adopt such a system. You want, so there are basically maybe like 5,000 organizations in the Netherlands who are large enough to adopt such a system. So that would be your population for a specific technology. And for other technologies in society as a whole, you know, for the mobile phone, for example, everyone is in the population. Yeah. And we can maybe check, I'm not sure if we have time for that, but let's do it anyway. Question 1, no. Sorry, I'm going to create a poll. I have a smart watch. Yes. Save. Now I want to launch my poll. Okay. So I'm going to see how many of you have a smartwatch. So if you could answer yes or no. I would guess that we're about in the early adopters to early majority stage of smartwatch adoption. 9. I only have 89 people left in my lecture. Oh, terrible. Oh, 103, sorry. Okay. $95, $96. No, not everyone needs to answer, so I'm going to end it in a second. So 22% of you have a smartwatch, and that's, I think, where we are in smartwatch adoption now. So if you look at, well, share results. Can you see this now? The first option, no, but I want one. Yes, but it's always empty. Yeah, I know there are other answer categories, but you know, let's keep it relatively simple for now. But I can understand that you great, thanks, that you want one, because we're kind of here in the adoption curve for smartwatches. So innovators have had smartwatches for a while. You know, they paid a lot of money for the first smartwatches, but didn't really work that well. And then we saw the early adopters, and smartwatches kind of matured. And now we kind of reach this stage. We kind of 22%, kind of here. And we see that more and more people own a smartwatch, or they want a smartwatch. And you see that this also kind of really resembles the S-curve of technology. So for smartwatches, we're entering this stage. And then here, no, I did not draw that one well. So, yeah. So that would be the S-curve of technology over the diffusion curve. Because you would say, so here, a lot of people are going to adopt the technology. So you earn a lot of money, you see a lot of improvements. And then here, when the laggards start adopting a smartwatch, you will see that there are hardly any major improvements over previous versions of the smartwatch. And then it's time maybe to introduce smart glasses again. And then we may start off a new cycle. So for now, you see that if you, of course, you were students and you are really on par with technology. I think if you look at society as a whole, I think smartwatches are still here or so in the early adopter stage, but within our subpopulation of young professionals, we are about here in the adoption of smartwatches. So you see that's the adoption curve. And you also see that it's quite useful for organizations to decide, okay, where are we? How should we market the technology? Because if you're here and if you want to market smartwatches, it's not really useful to, very good question, I'll get to that in a minute. So when you're here, it's not very useful to launch mass media campaigns about smartwatches because it's still in the early stages, and people who want a smartwatch will buy one because they are really early adopters of these kinds of technologies. Then people kind of convince each other, and I think we now kind of enter a stage where you will see more and more mass market campaigns for smartwatches because organizations want more and more people to adopt a watch like that. So you see that a curve like that, so see how many people have adopted such technology, is really useful to decide, okay, to decide who to target your innovation to. So shall we target it to the general population in mass market campaigns? Should we have a more smaller focused campaign using opinion leaders and influencers, etc. So this curve is quite useful practically to decide your course of action as an organization. More about the chasm in a moment. If you don't know what I'm talking about with chasm, it will become clear. So, and this is, for example, the adoption curve for a couple of technologies. It's quite old because you see the cell phone here. So this is like 10 years old, but I couldn't find a better, newer one with high enough resolution, and I was a bit lazy. But you see that for some technologies, it really took a long time. So for the car, is still adopting. The phone, it took a long time. There's even a drop in adoption, Second World War. But for things like the television and radio, it went, well, very quickly for the television. And for the cell phone and internet, it was like, yeah. I think in the Netherlands for broadband internet, it took maybe 6-7 years or so for it to adopt up until the laggards, I think. But for example, the electric car, I think that will take longer. So it will take a longer time before everyone has an electric car, simply because the technology doesn't improve so quickly, and it is a really expensive thing to buy. So for electric cars, we're still, well, somewhere, maybe also early adopters now, because there's a lot of hybrid cars. So for electric cars, we are also here. Well, finally, and then we get into the chasm and some more practical recommendations. Like I said, the innovation adopts through a social system, and again, the social system is your population for your innovation, not everyone necessarily. And of course, you have to take into account in the social system a lot of different factors. So, sorry, no more stripes on my face. You have to take into account a lot of different factors that affect the adoption of the innovation, like the laws and policies in a certain in a certain cultural group or geographic region. You know, like different countries having different rules, norms and values of people adopting an innovation. The communication channels that are available in a certain social systems, the networks that exist in a certain social situation, the individuals in the social system, etc. So this is basically, Rogers devotes a lot of attention to these aspects, but this has more to do with, you know, social, cultural, legal issues, which are a bit beyond the scope of this course. But we talk about them a bit more in 2 weeks when we talk about the strategy of an organization. What if the innovation doesn't fit the social system? Well, then you have made a mistake as an organization in your innovation. Because what you, but it's a good question though, because what you need to do as an organization, you need to think in the early stages of the invention even, why is my innovation useful? And then next week we discuss a thing called the business model canvas, in which one of the aspects is that you have to tie in characteristics of your innovation with the needs and wants of the people. And one of the first things you have to do if you want to innovate or want to bring something new to market is thinking about, okay, does the idea that I have match what people want? So I think that more about that next week. Still kind of vague to me. Can I explain maybe laws and policies with an example? Yeah, well, as you know, a very simple example would be that now the government and many governments around the globe are pushing electric vehicles, so which makes the adoption of electric vehicles probably a bit easier. So this has consequences for car companies and other companies who want to hop on the bandwagon, because the laws and policies that come into place right now in many countries probably will quicken the adoption of the innovation. So that's an example of laws and policies that are in place or that will be in place that you can take into account when thinking about the diffusion of an innovation. Yeah, with plastic straws, yeah, as well. Yeah, yeah. You know, Rogers even talks about social innovations. For example, think about gay marriage. So in cultures like ours, well, at least mine, gay marriage is okay, and we are kind of already in the laggard stage in which I think about 93% of the people in the Netherlands think, well, probably a bit less, but most people in the Netherlands think gay marriage is okay, fortunately. But if you think of other countries with other laws and policies, and especially other norms and values, the adoption of gay marriage will probably be a lot slower, if ever. And this is maybe kind of a weird example, but I give it on purpose because you can also consider a thing like that as an innovation. You know, it's a change in a system over time that you want to communicate throughout the whole social system. So things like policies or ideas in a society can also be seen as a kind of an innovation. And you maybe you're very conservative and you think, well, it's not an innovation, it's gay marriage, it's wrong. So if you think that, you may not consider it to be an innovation. But people used to think that of mobile phones also 10 years ago. There's a very fun movie on a short video on YouTube where they asked people in 1999 if they would ever adopt a mobile phone. And they all say, well, no, I don't need that because who on earth needs a mobile phone? So they don't even consider a mobile phone to be an innovation. They consider it to be something completely useless. So what people even consider an innovation also is really dependent on the social system. So the video is absolutely great. If someone can find it here and post a link to that video, it's really fun to observe. It's in Dutch, unfortunately. So I hope it clarifies your question a bit. So it's the same as plastic straws. Yeah. Thanks, Lorenzo. Then we get to the chasm, because that's based on Gartner's hype cycle. It was a question. Smartwatches are not beyond the chasm yet. I think they are. I think they are. I'm not completely sure. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Ah, great. Thank you very much. Oh, watch that movie. Or if we have 1 minute left at the end of the presentation, I will show it. But I want to finish the last part about the chasm, so it won't take long. Probably you are now clicking the video and watching it during the lecture. So Gartner's hype cycle is Gartner's hype cycle ties the diffusion of innovation curve with a kind of a theory about a critical mass for adoption. So you can imagine, if you look at this diffusion curve, that there is a kind of a critical mass that you need to reach, and beyond which an innovation will kind of diffuse itself. So you need enough people to have a mobile phone, and afterwards everyone will just adopt it because they so clearly see the usefulness, and you have kind of network effects. And we're also getting there, I think, with smartwatches. So at a certain point, so many people will have smartwatches that kind of adopts itself. So they say for every innovation, you need a kind of a critical mass, And if you don't reach the critical mass, the innovation will either fizzle out entirely or will only be used by a very specific group of people, which are only the innovators and maybe a couple of early adopters. So Gartner says you need to reach the critical mass in order for the innovation to reach full adoption. And the critical mass is about here, in between the early adopters and the early majority. And that is what they call the chasm. Because they say, well, if you look at the innovators and early adopters, they are people who are swayed and who are convinced of using a new technology by the technology itself. So they are the people who think, smartwatch, cool. Smartwatch is cool because it's a new technology. It provides a new kind of, so especially for innovators, some kind of new thing I can fiddle with. And for adopters, new technology that I can use for my own personal performance to keep track of things. So those are the people who are in it for the technology. So they are called the technology enthusiasts and the visionaries. So from the early majority on, they are people who are in it for the convenience. So they are people who are not convinced by cool technology. They are convinced purely because it's useful, purely because it targets one of their needs or it makes life much easier. And that is a chasm that creates a chasm because in your strategy for adopting the innovation or for getting the innovation adopted, you need to have a change in communication about the innovation. So you need to go from, okay, this innovation is cool, it's a new technology, to this innovation is useful for you. And that is often very difficult to do. So you see that many innovations, they sometimes, they come to the innovator and early adopter stage, or sometimes they even get only to the innovator stage, and then they reach kind of a choke point, in which there is no further adoption because people don't see usefulness. And that is what's called the chasm. And the chasm is related to Gartner's hype cycle, because they say, well, if you look at the visibility of technology or how popular technologies are, well, in a minute, then you see kind of a curve like this, which they call a hype cycle. So in the beginning, there's kind of a technology trigger, and you have kind of a new technology. Then suddenly the technology becomes very popular, and then there's many times there's kind of a drop in the visibility and popularity of the technology, in which people think from, well, is this it? Is this all we can do with the technology? And then it can either go one of two ways, or the technology fizzles out and you will never hear from it again, or it finally comes out of the chasm and reaches what they call slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. It's a consultancy corporation after all, so they're very good. So they're very good in marketing themselves. But then you see that the innovation takes off again and becomes popular. Robin, thanks very much. That really helps. So yeah, so there are, I'm not always consistent, but in it, but there are notes under the slides, and I never remove the notes. I just leave them be. So you can, for some lectures you're lucky, and there are actually notes there, which can also help you study. So for this one, there are notes. So I have to repeat critical mass and chasm anyways for the next slide. So you can kind of overlay the hype cycle here with the diffusion of innovation, and you see that at the beginning of technological innovation, there's a lot of attention for the technology, So you see the technology. So in all kinds of specialized magazines, you see a lot of attention for the technology, and then it's the early innovators who adopt it. Then you have may have a chasm in which people think, oh, well, is that all? And then it reaches some kind of a point in which people cannot really see the benefits of the technology, and that's what they call the chasm. And you have to get out of the chasm with your technology in order for it to diffuse throughout the system. So if you overlay the hype cycle with the diffusion curve, it kind of goes something like this. So the innovators and early adopters innovate the adoption, and they think, oh, very cool, we need this innovation. But then you need to reach a stage where many more people need to adopt the innovation. And then the people may say, well, is this all? It's a cool technology, but I'm not sure how it's useful in my life. And then you can you can fall in the chasm, and your technology can, quit being useful. So we had that a couple of years ago with a very with Google Glasses. So I gave the example before. So Google Glasses was hyped a bunch of years ago. And there were a lot of innovators experimenting with Google Glasses. Oh, maybe you can use it for this, maybe you can use it for that. But the problem that Google Glasses would solve, the actual benefits for a large majority of people, were not clear. So it really was hyped. So the Google Glasses were really here at the top of the curve, and then they fell into the chasm and they never got out of it, because Google could not make the case for why they would need everyone to adopt more glasses. And we see that now the technology is used again. And I think, like Robin says here, there are, where is that slide? So there are many different hype cycles. So what Gartner does, and what they earn a lot of money with, is helping organizations decide where their technology is currently located. So this is the example of the hype cycle for emerging technologies for this year, in which you see, well, there are a lot of different difficult, really technical innovations here. But for example, if you see here non-fungible tokens, they're all the hype now. So non-fungible tokens are really hyped as a way to actually attach some kind of persisting value to a digital object. But the actual usefulness of those non-fungible tokens is not that clear yet. So it's really hyped, and they will probably fall into a chasm very soon. And then it's not clear yet if they will ever get out. So what Gartner does is start trying to predict which products will drop into the chasm, where they are located, and which one will become successful. Well, no, the technology does not have to be innovated again in order for people to adopt it, but you just need to basically rebrand it. So it goes from this, consumers want technology and performance, to this. So if you look at the mobile phone, for example, the first people who adopt, so the smartphone, the first people who adopt the smartphone would say, this is cool, look at the touchscreen, look at the new technology. But then a lot of people said, well, very nice, all those new fidgety things, but what is it useful for? And people only started adopting the smartphone en masse when they realized, oh, it's not only a cool technology, it's actually useful in my life. So it's actually offers solutions to problems I have in terms of making appointments, communicating, navigating, etc. So it is useful and convenient, and then they adopt it. So the technology doesn't have to change, but you're indeed right, there can be innovations in the technology. So for example, the first smartwatches were terrible. They had a battery life of 2 hours. They had a user interface which was absolutely rubbish. And then you had some innovation in those smartwatches. And now you see that if you now buy a smartwatch, it's relatively easy to use, and it will last you a couple of days before you have to recharge. So there were some minor innovations in smartwatch design, which may convince people that it's not only a cool technology, but that it's actually useful. So it has to be innovated again, so it has to be improved, but not a completely new technology. Well, and you could use these hype cycles. So this is an example from the paper. So for example, if you notice that a technology which is in your area as an organization is kind of here, then you need to aggressively invest in order to not miss the bus. But if you see that if a technology for you as an organization is not that important, and you see that it's about here or here, then it's probably best to wait it out to see if it becomes popular. So you can use this to your advantage. This slide, this one. Okay. Yeah, well, the thing is, you don't. The problem is that, of course, this is, you are never sure where you are in the technology cycle. Of course, you know how many people adopted it, but you never know as an organization with certainty how deep the chasm is. Because for some technologies like the mobile phone and the smartphone, there was hardly a chasm at all. So it just adopted very quickly. So for others, they kind of drop down and it takes a couple of years for them to become a success. And Gartner and other companies, they earn a lot of money by helping organizations to predict where exactly the technology is located. But you can do your best. You know, you can hire Gartner. You can invest in consultants. You can invest in research and development in order to try to predict which technology will be successful, and things like hype cycles and diffusion curves help you with that, but ultimately it's just a prediction, of course. So in sum, the use for diffusion of innovation is that it helps you understand the adoption of a technology throughout a social system, so throughout your target population. But, and we will discuss that next week, of course, well, there's not really a however. So you have to take into account when thinking about adoption of technology that there are different types of adoption. So if you're a niche market, adoption is different than if you have a product for the entire market. There is an individual adoption and a system adoption. So it's not really a however, but there are some caveats that we'll discuss in the coming weeks. I have a question about the individual assignment. So I think this is, yeah, next week we do nothing but the individual assignment. I will post the slides for the lecture on database and database design online next week. And then you can start the individual assignment. If you already know something about database and database design, the assignment is already on Canvas, so you can go ahead and work on the assignment. But the deadline, I think, is only at the end of November, so whatever you want. Is there something we need to do for next week? Well, if I were you, I would start working on your business plan, because there is a presentation in 2 weeks coming up, and you need to develop a product and develop the innovation and think about the innovation. So if I were you, I would definitely start with the business plan with your group. And for the group assessment, I'm not sure if I understand your question. But this was it for this week. So I will